I believe that there are some basic truths in life. And one of my big things is you get what you pay for. Okay. Like this is something that's been pretty evident in my life. And I'd be willing to bet that you've experienced something similar in your lifetime as well. And as I was thinking about this concept, I was reminded of the different cars that I've bought throughout my life. I'll never forget my senior year. I'm working hard all summer, doing my best to save money, wanted to buy a car before I went off to college. So I'm working and I'm working, getting up at like 5 o'clock in the morning to go and mow lawns. And it was terrible. I hated that summer. But the moment I bought my first car, it felt amazing, felt so incredibly cool. Okay. My first car was crap. Okay. And it didn't last very long because I paid a whopping $1,800 for it. It was a white 1999 Toyota RAV4. That thing was older than I was when I bought it. Okay. It was terrible. I drove it to college. It lasted like 2 years. Didn't pick up any chicks in it because, once again, it was a white 1999 Toyota RAV4. It's basically a white box on wheels. Okay. Rough. It lasted me like 2 years. Okay, I drive it back home and it like wouldn't start. When it did start, it sounded weird. So I sold it for basically parts. Okay, sold it for, like $1,800. Okay, somehow, miraculously. And then I took that money plus some other money that I had made and I went out and I bought my second car. It was a truck, 2004 black Nissan Frontier. Loved that thing. Okay, spent a little less than $5,000 for it. And it lasted a good bit of time. Okay, I had it for about 4 years. Okay, helped me pick up my beautiful wife, who I'm now married to. Okay, I feel like if I wasn't driving that truck, she probably wouldn't have liked me. But I was, and it was fantastic. Had a little gated thing on the front. It looked sick. Loved that truck. And then I totaled it in March. Okay, guy drove through a red light, hit me. Not great. And so I total it in March. Then, about 5 months ago, my wife go out and we bought a 2014 Acura RDX. And let's just say we spent a little more than $5,000 on it. And what I've noticed is that the more money that I've put into the cars that I've bought, the longer that they last. Okay, and when you pay for something nice and you pay for something expensive or something that's important, especially big things, they tend to last a little bit longer. So not my goal in life, but I think a principle that I live by is that when I'm spending money on things that matter, housing, cars, electronics, whatever it is, I like to spend a little bit more because I want to buy something that lasts. And when I look at sports and I look at the way that organizations spend their money, I believe that the same thing is true. You get what you pay for. The Steelers don't have a quarterback this year. They're bouncing back and forth between Justin Fields and Russell Wilson because they haven't put any money. They haven't invested anything of any significance into the position. The Steelers gave up a 2026 conditional pick for Justin Fields. They didn't put anything into the position. They're paying Russell Wilson $1.2 million this year while the Denver Broncos are picking up the rest of the tab. They haven't put anything into the position. And Steeler fans are going to look up in week 10 and be like, why can't we score any points? I can tell you, it's because the Steelers organization didn't invest in the position. And they're going to sit back and they'll be like, oh, like we get all these stops and we can't score. And then you look at how the Steelers have spent their money. The majority of their money is on the defensive side of the ball. So, of course, they're going to get stops. That's the side of the ball that they have invested in. When you look at the Colts, or when I look at the Colts, it's the exact same thing. This exact same principle applies. Okay? The Colts have a terrible secondary this year. And it's not a surprise because they haven't invested in it at all. They haven't put any money into it. Kenny Moore is the highest paid defensive back on this Colts roster. His base salary this year, he's going to make a little over $4 million. Like, yeah, that's a lot of money. But by NFL standards, that is not a lot of money. The second highest paid defensive back for the Colts is Julian Blackmon, whose base salary this year is set at a little over $1 million. Once again, it's a lot of money for someone like me. But for these NFL guys, that's not. It's not a lot of money for these NFL dudes. There are two cornerbacks on this Colts roster, Jalen Jones and Dallas Flowers. They are both set to make less than $1 million this year. And they're going to get playing time. One of them is going to start. Of course, the Colts secondary is terrible. They haven't invested anything into it. They haven't invested any draft picks. They haven't invested any money. Like, of course, this secondary is going to be bad. And then I look at the rest of the NFL, and I look at specifically the Cleveland Browns, a team that's going to have one of, if not the best, secondary in the NFL this year. Their best cornerback, Denzel Ward, is the third highest paid player on their roster. Their second best cornerback is the 14th highest paid player on their roster. Of course, their secondary is going to be good. They've actually invested money into it. Okay, and then we look at the Colts roster. You know what position is going to be really good for them? The defensive line, because they've invested draft capital and money into that unit. Okay, and at the end of the year, we're going to look up, we're going to look at this Colts defense, and we're going to be like, geez, man, they just can't stop anybody from throwing the ball. Teams are just throwing the ball all over the field, and people are going to be like, Gus Bradley, why aren't you doing a better job? And I'm here to tell you right now, the Colts secondary being bad this year will not be Gus Bradley's fault. At the end of the year, it's on Chris Ballard. Okay? At the end of the year, Chris Ballard's going to look up and wonder why his secondary was awful. And it won't be because of Gus Bradley. It'll be because Chris Ballard and the rest of this front office didn't invest in it. Okay, if you want something to be good, you have to invest in it. Okay, whether that's money or draft picks. Even in our daily lives, like if you want to be good at shooting basketball, you have to invest time into that thing to be good at it. Okay, Chris Ballard simply hasn't made this a priority, even though it clearly should have been when he looked at the roster at the end of last year. Okay, he hasn't, I've talked about the money side of things and how they haven't, signed any free agents. They aren't paying anyone anything big, and they haven't drafted anyone to address this need either. Okay, Kenny Moore was undrafted. Juju Brents was a second-round pick. He's the highest drafted player in this Colts secondary. Nick Cross was a third-round pick. Julian Blackmon was a third-round pick. Dallas Flowers, a guy who might start at corner this year, was undrafted. Jalen Jones was a seventh-round pick. Like, come on now. Ballard clearly hasn't invested money or draft picks into this group. And that's why it's going to be terrible. And we're going to look up in week, 10, 11, 12, whatever. We may look up in week 4 and be like, geez, Gus Bradley, you stink. Like, why can't this defense get stops? And I'm telling you, it's not on Gus Bradley. It's on Chris Ballard. Okay, we talk about coaching and the importance of it, and coaching is very important. But at the end of the day, if you don't have the guys, it's hard to do anything. And the Colts secondary, they clearly don't have the dudes. They don't have the talent. They don't have the players to be successful. And that is not Gus Bradley's fault. That is Chris Ballard's fault. He hasn't prioritized this secondary at all. He hasn't invested any money into it. He hasn't invested any draft picks into it. And that is an issue. It really, really is. And we're going to look up at the end of the year and we're going to blame all this on Gus Bradley. And I'm sure to tell you, it's not Gus Bradley's fault. This secondary being awful, that responsibility falls squarely on the shoulders of Chris Ballard. He hasn't prioritized it. He knew all off season all offseason that this secondary was hands down going to be the weak point of this team. And he didn't do anything to help it. With the 15th overall pick, he drafted Leatu Latu. He didn't have to draft Latu. He could have drafted the best corner available because every corner was still on the board. Okay, but instead, he decided to continue to hammer home the importance of the defensive line. And while I generally agree with that philosophy, that games are won in the trenches and that you need, to have good defensive linemen in order to win games. While I, agree with that for the most part, I think this is one of the issues with Ballard is he's overly invested in that philosophy. Okay, at some point, like you have to be able to step back and be like, hey, I know that we want, to have a good defensive line and that we want to win in the trenches. Because once again, that's important. That's where teams win games. Okay, the NFL is all about quarterback play. Okay, so if you can keep your quarterback upright and allow him to play well, and you can rough up the other team's quarterback, you're going to win a lot of games. But part of that comes from having a good secondary. Okay, if guys are getting open in 2 seconds or less, doesn't matter how great your defensive line is, you aren't going to generate any pressure whatsoever. Okay? Like at some point, Chris Ballard has to realize that you have to invest and put money in and spend draft picks on positions, other than the defensive line. Once again, at the end of the year, when we look up and this Colts defense is ranked amongst the worst in the NFL, Gus Bradley's going to receive a lot of the blame, and he shouldn't. This falls squarely on the shoulders of Chris Ballard. But here's what's going to happen. This Colts defense is going to be bad. Okay? I think we all know that. And at the end of the year, Gus Bradley will be fired. That he will be the scapegoat this year. Okay? Even though it's not Gus Bradley's fault that his best defensive back is a 7th round pick out of Texas A&M and Jalen Jones. Okay? This isn't on Gus Bradley. This is squarely on Chris Ballard.